many of us, including myself, have written about the various scalawags and rapscallions who inhabit the senior levels of the Trump administration. But many of those people, a number of those people, are in fact so problematic that they deserve an entire book just to themselves. And when it comes to Stephen Mnuchin, Secretary of the Treasury, that need has now been fulfilled. There is a new book about Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin entitled Fat Cat, the Steve Mnuchin story. It's published by Strong Arm Friends and Strong Arm Press and our good friends there. And the co-author of that book joins us now. It was written by Rebecca Burns and David Dayen. Rebecca Burns is an investigative reporter. She is a contributing editor at In These Times magazine, and you may have seen her stuff at ProPublica or The Intercept. She's covered Wall Street and a lot of the stuff we care about, and she joins us now. So first of all, Rebecca, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
And secondly, for people who may have just vaguely heard the name Steve Mnuchin, or maybe haven't even heard the name, what should they know about him?
Right. So Steve Mnuchin is the Secretary of the Treasury, which is not one of the sexier cabinet positions, but it's something that actually has, myriad functions that end up having a lot of sway on the lives of ordinary people. And Steve Mnuchin's particular background is that he is sort of the child of a famous Wall Street banker, and himself someone who spent years at Goldman Sachs in the hedge fund world, eventually earning him the nickname the Foreclosure King for the work that he did running a bank called One West. So Mnuchin's entry into the Treasury was in some corners kind of hailed as like a moderating influence compared to people who are sort of career, white supremacists, having kind of a hedge fund guy who is purportedly non-ideological was sort of a relief in some quarters. But I think our book is really showing how the agenda that he's pushing is one of a Wall Street ideologue who has a long career of inflicting pain on homeowners in particular.
Yeah, when, Foreclosure King, who just happens to not be a white supremacist, is like your calling card, is, okay, I won't even finish that sentence, but, okay, so Steve Mnuchin, and, as I say, I've written a little bit about it, but nothing like you guys have done, but Steve Mnuchin, born into privilege and, given a place at the table, and I think at Goldman Sachs, right?
Right.
And like his father before him, and makes a ton of money, buys a bank, One West Bank. It gets dubbed the Foreclosure King, famously foreclosed on an older widow for, what was it, a $33 or 33 cent or something?
27 cents.
A 27 cent shortfall in her ability, forecloses on her. So the fact is there are not many, even white nationalists, I think, who can claim to have inflicted that much misery on so many people. And I believe he's also done some film production. Isn't that right?
Yes, yeah. In addition to inflicting pain, through his foreclosure practices, we could say he's inflicting pain through backing like American Sniper and Suicide Squad, as well as some good films. But he sort of had a little side career as a Hollywood financier that's pretty bizarre, honestly.
Yeah, and Suicide Squad, which is a film about a group of supervillains who get together and ostensibly attempt to do good is, I've always thought that's like the perfect metaphor for the Trump
It
administration.
sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. And so, okay, so you and David Dayen, and Dave's been on the show a number of times. You and Dave have written this show, this book, Fat Cat, the Steve Mnuchin story. So, it must have been a challenge in writing about Steve Mnuchin. So many of the aspects of his career that people should know about. I mean, we can talk about the juicy stuff and the insensitivity he's shown through his wife and through his public comments, but a lot of the Steve Mnuchin story that matters is buried in some, what might be called technical minutia of the governance of the Treasury Department and the economy. But you talk in your book, let's talk about the personality stuff first. I get the sense of Mnuchin from your book and from elsewhere as being a guy who's not only rapaciously greedy, but actually is self-righteous about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's bad enough when somebody picks your pocket, but then when they expect you to thank them for it, it's really annoying. So that's when you're getting annoyed. So you and Dave describe a situation where protesters confront Stephen Mnuchin about I believe about the tax cut. You remember that scene?
Yeah, so there was sort of repeating motif of protesters converging on Mnuchin's, enormous Beverly Hills home. The first time was during the height of the foreclosure crisis, actually, when there were protesters led by a woman named Rose Goodiel, who her family was facing foreclosure as a result of lost income following the murder of her brother. So this really horrific situation. She was fighting with community groups to save her home. I think that was in 2011 that they first marched there, and then returned on the eve of Mnuchin's confirmation as Treasury Secretary to deliver this message that Mnuchin has demonstrated that he doesn't care about ordinary people. And to your point about his self-righteousness, one of the things that's just sort of, an extra galling detail is that Mnuchin, after that first protest, started having his address scrubbed from the internet. He was sort of so wounded that protesters had come to his home. He sort of talked about, he was afraid that it would have an effect on his children. And this is happening while he's, responsible for families with young children being thrown out of their homes. He apparently also really dislikes the name Foreclosure King, is something that comes up humorously frequently. He mentioned it in his initial testimony to Congress, that's something that hurts his feelings, that he doesn't like to hear, that he thinks is unfair. I think the sense that we had in looking through the various stages of his life and his career is someone who really is maybe unaware of sort of the enormous unearned privilege that they have, and the effect that his policies have on ordinary people.
So has anyone offered to suggest an alternate name to Foreclosure King that he might be more comfortable with, like blood-sucking monster or horrific, predator, a financial predator? Or something? I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but
right, yeah, we could do some brainstorming. That wasn't part of the writing process, but perhaps next time.
Yeah, I mean, I think Fat Cat is very accurate. Almost too nice for the guy, but so he lectures people, about how they should be thankful for whatever. It's basically scraps on the table they get as a one-time deal for this tax cut for billionaires and so on. So he's a dislikable guy, and we don't blame around here. We don't blame people for the actions of their spouses necessarily, but his wife has basically been, kind of deeply insensitive, I would say, about her own, personal image and how that might affect, her tweeting and Instagram and all that. And he certainly hasn't gone out of his way to say, it might be insensitive when so many people are hurting economically to take a government-paid trip to Kentucky and then to tweet about or Instagram about the Hermes scarf and Valentino rock stud heels and Tom Ford sunnies and Roland Murray pants you were wearing. I mean, it kind of speaks to, on a personal level, the fact that he and she both think that's okay, that they live in this insular bubble of privilege where they don't even recognize, which I would argue is Trump himself as well, right, where they don't recognize the impact of their policies on the world around them. Is that fair, you think?
Yeah, I think it's very fair. Olivia Nuzzi at the New Yorker had a great line that Mnuchin and his wife, Louise Linton, are sort of the obtuse avatars of the Trump government. So this style of governance that's sort of a mix of willful oblivion and ill intent really kind of defines particularly Mnuchin, but some other quarters of the administration as well.
Yeah, to paraphrase Louis XIV, l'économie c'est moi. But yeah, they don't even care. They don't even know. But the difference between, I would argue, between Steve Mnuchin and Donald Trump is that Steve Mnuchin is, in fact, I would say Trump has a certain kind of canny smartness, but of a feral, undisciplined nature. He's not stupid, but I would argue that Steve Mnuchin is actually very savvy about financial matters, that he knows his numbers, he knows his finance, and in a way that Trump does not. Trump, is a hustler and so on. But I would argue that the difference between Trump and Mnuchin is that Mnuchin knows how to work the numbers to his benefit and knows what policies he's for and against to help the numbers go to his benefit. Do you think that's fair?
It's hard to say exactly, certainly, what Mnuchin's level of competency, how much of it is sort of bluster. He's made some sort of spectacular gaffes, particularly when he tries to talk about monetary policy. But I think certainly we can say, for someone who was sort of literally raised on Wall Street, that's been his crowd his whole life. He has, I'm sure, a very good sense of what policies he thinks will benefit, the places and the people that he's worked with for not only his entire career, but because his father was a prominent Goldman Sachs banker, literally his entire life. So in that way, he has been very effective in kind of pushing through the types of deregulatory policies that are topping Wall Street's wish list. He's been able to do that, working in many cases with heads of other agencies who have come in some cases because Mnuchin appointed them, or in other cases Trump appointed them. People who are also in Mnuchin's circles, either at One West or at other banks. During and the aftermath of the foreclosure crisis are now the people who are running our institutions that are supposed to regulate the banks. So, by virtue of that, certainly they know what they want done and they have a sense of how to do it.
Yeah, I thank you for that corrective, because one of the things I think people don't understand about Wall Street gurus, I'm always making this point, or was when I was writing about him a lot, about Jamie Dimon, for example, the head of J.P. Morgan Chase. And people say, well, he's financially so savvy. No, these guys are salesmen first and foremost, and hustlers and promoters first and foremost, and they don't necessarily know the policy or finance details. They are also, in a sense, deal makers, but just at a more complex level, perhaps, than a Donald Trump. But so thanks for that corrective, because I can certainly see that Steve Mnuchin might be one of those guys, but he certainly pushed for policies that would benefit him, where Trump seems to be sometimes like a blank slate. I don't know, what should I do about trade or regulation or this and that? Steve Mnuchin knows what he wants and how to get it. So thanks for that corrective. And we've just got a minute or two left. But any particular policies people should know about that Mnuchin's been pushing on or has pushed on successfully?
Right. Well, I think on that same theme, that because of Mnuchin's professional background, spent in Wall Street, he's pushing through some of the biggest items on Wall Street's wish list. There are a couple of areas that we looked at really closely. One of them is the Community Reinvestment Act. So that is legislation that went through in the 70s to kind of try and correct the legacy of banks' redlining, of refusing to lend in minority neighborhoods. And as head of One West, Mnuchin was accused of running afoul of the Community Reinvestment Act, of not making loans in Black and Brown communities. One community organization, the California Reinvestment Coalition, crunched the numbers and found that the ratio of loans that they made in neighborhoods of color to foreclosures was like 1 to 9. So they foreclosed 9 times for every time that they made a mortgage loan, or a loan in Black and Brown neighborhoods. So there's still actually a federal housing discrimination complaint pending against Mnuchin and One West Bank as he's Treasury Secretary. And while that complaint is still pending, Mnuchin and the Treasury submitted proposals to sort of dramatically rewrite, and I think we can say undermine the Community Reinvestment Act. So that's an example of a policy that sort of irked him while he was at the head of a bank, and that now he's sort of able to go in and rewrite with other heads of similar institutions, as he chooses. Mm-hmm.
And by so doing, basically steps on a number of what I would consider core American values, including fairness, transparency, and racial justice. So it's kind of a threefer on that one. So I'm glad you brought that up. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but thanks for writing this profile of this American sniper who's aiming at the dreams of working families all across the country. So Rebecca Burns, the book is Fat Cat, the Steve Mnuchin story, by Rebecca and David Dayen. So Rebecca, thanks so much for writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me again.